Elektromobilność przestaje być niszą, a staje się jednym z kluczowych filarów transformacji transportu, energetyki i całej gospodarki. To przestrzeń, w której spotykają się europejskie polityki klimatyczne, rozwój technologii, nawyki użytkowników oraz plany przemysłu motoryzacyjnego. Jednocześnie to obszar pełen emocji, mitów, niepewności i zmian regulacyjnych. W naszej serii Na prąd zadajemy podstawowe pytania. Czym jest elektromobilność? Jakie szanse tworzy? Jakie wyzwania generuje? I jak wpływa na energetykę, miasta, produkcję, rynek pracy oraz codzienną mobilność? Sprawdzamy, jak powstaje nowy ekosystem. Od produkcji baterii przez infrastrukturę po modele biznesowe i regulacje, które mają sprawić, by transformacja mobilności była sprawiedliwa. Serię przygotowaliśmy we współpracy z organizacją T&E i w pierwszym odcinku rozmawiamy z jej szefem, Williamem Todtsem. Ja nazywam się Dominik Brodacki, jestem szefem działu energetycznego w Polityce Insight i zapraszam na dzisiejszy odcinek. So let's start by defining our key concepts. We often hear that e-mobility represents a transformation of transport. But what exactly should we understand by that? What technologies and initiatives make up this ecosystem? I mean, how has that definition evolved in recent years, and what does that mean for Poland and for Europe?
Electromobility, everybody thinks about cars, but electromobility is a new form of mobility that is enabled by cheap, high-performance batteries, which we did not have that 30 years ago, but in the last 10, 15 years, that new technology has developed. And we can use batteries to power cars, to power trucks, to power ships, to power small planes, drones. It is much more than just electric cars. What does it mean for Europe and Poland and for the world? It means that, we have driven around in vehicles with combustion engines for the last more than 100 years. And in the next decades, that is going to change completely. So this is one of the biggest revolutions in mobility in history.
So looking more broadly, are electric vehicles an end in themselves or just a milestone on the way to a bigger mobility revolution? I mean, autonomy, sharing, and seamless integration with public transport.
They are a major milestone. I think we need to remember that automobility it has enabled personal mobility in a way that was never possible in history. So it's been a real force for good countries where it exists, but it's associated with some major problems. Pollution, carbon emissions, or in the case of Europe, dependence on energy imports. The transition to electromobility allows us to solve a number of those big problems that we have with combustion engines and still keep all the good things that we have with personal mobility. So actually, in the life of a normal person or in the life of a company, not that much will change. You will still be able to drive around the country, go to work, etc. This is a major milestone. I do think it's not the end of the transition, because autonomy, and people talk about this as if it's science fiction, but in San Francisco or in Texas, I have very significant shares of people taking autonomous taxis. It's happening on the road, like in San Francisco, it's like 30% of the market. If it's happening there on the road, it will come to Europe as well. That's the next step. But I think it will be a while before we will all drive autonomous vehicles, and I'm not sure that will ever be the case.
So that's why we are talking about revolution. And now I'd like to invite you to tackle the question regarding the practical difference between battery vehicle and the plug-in hybrids. Why, from the perspective of the transition and everyday users, a plug-in hybrid's often not good enough, in your opinion?
Battery electric vehicles is 100% electric. A plug-in hybrid vehicle is essentially a combustion engine vehicle that has the ability to do some kilometers electrically. The beauty of a hybrid system is that you can do two things. The problem with a hybrid system is that you add complexity. You have a system that is more expensive, and you have a system that is not very good at either of the applications. So it's not a great combustion engine car because it's driving around with like 500 kilograms of battery, so it's very heavy. And it's not a very good electric car because it can only drive 50 kilometers. And if it's a bit colder, even less. People think they're buying the best of both worlds, but they often end up buying or using the worst of both worlds. I don't have a problem with plug-in hybrids in the transition. I think the big problem is when people say that this is the future of the automobile industry. I have friends and family that drive those vehicles. That's okay. And it can make sense for people, but we should not pretend they're 100% clean vehicles. We should not encourage our auto industry to make this the focus of their innovation efforts, because this is not the future.
I'd love to hear your perspective on the place of e-mobility in EU climate policy. As you know, over the years, EU climate policy has grown from a technical economic initiative to a central pillar of European politics. How has the EU's approach to e-mobility evolved within this context?
I think electrification has always been a mix between climate and industrial policy. I think so. I've been working at TNE for 15 years, and since the beginning, the first BMW electric car, the first Nissan electric cars, the first Teslas, it was always clear that this was not just a climate policy or an environmental policy. Back in the day when we used to do environmental policy for cars, it was about putting a catalyst on the vehicle so that the emissions of the NOx would be a bit lower. You add one technology to improve the vehicle a little bit. Electrification completely changes the game because you're not changing one technology, you're changing the core of the vehicle. Basically, the only thing that remains is the wheels, the steering wheel, and the seats, but the whole operating system of the vehicle is different. Right now, I would say that it's for Europe, and I would add for Poland, it's a mix of, yes, it's important for the climate, but it's also a huge industrial challenge and opportunity. Because Europe, generally speaking, is a continent of incumbents. Our chemical industry, our steel industry, our auto industry, these are all companies that were created like 100 years ago or even like 150 years ago. And now this transition is happening and you cannot stop it. Even if you like to stop it, you cannot stop it. You cannot stop technological innovation. China is racing ahead. So the question is Europe going to try and compete in this space? Yes or no? And how do we do that? And that will be good for the climate, but it is essential for the future of our industry. And if I think about a country like Poland, which I think has a lot of potential in this space, you're one of the biggest battery manufacturers in the world, as a matter of fact, with LG, but also a country that is heavily reliant on oil imports, a country that in the automotive sector is historically more assembling for the German car makers. The thing is that when things change, there's an opportunity to do things differently and to also change, where the value add is created.
So it's very important to emphasize that e-mobility is not about transport. It's about industry. It's about our whole economy. I mean, for example, supply chains, which are important for our technological independence, the power of Europe.
Yeah, I think this is a super important point that if you think about the future of warfare, and in Poland, you're very close to the war in Ukraine, we started off thinking that we needed to supply Ukraine with tanks because they needed tanks to fight the Russian tanks. Now it turns out that the tanks are not even entering the battlefield anymore because they're so vulnerable to drones. In the end, what is a drone? A drone is a small battery, a few electric motors, electronics, and a software system. And this is very similar to a mobile phone. And actually, it's very similar to an electric car too. So if Europe wants to be able to defend itself in the 21st century, it needs to have an industry that is able to produce these things at scale, because people think that wars are, it's like you have soldiers and then you have equipment, but you need to be able to produce if you want to win wars. We have an industrial base. We have a 20th century industrial base. And if we don't modernize that industrial base, we will be extremely vulnerable. If we don't have the industrial base in Europe, we will be vulnerable to economic coercion by China, which is what we're seeing on the critical mineral exports. But, in the future, you might see that on other technologies as well.
Let's go back to a climate perspective, let's say, and I would like to comfort you with thesis whether electromobility equals zero emissions. It is myth or real? How should we measure how green e-mobility truly is? Full life cycle of CO2 emissions, the share of renewables in electricity production, battery recycling, and so on. What's your perspective?
There's been an attempt to make this a very complicated debate. Actually, it's very simple. Look, the big environmental problem with cars is not that they have wheels or doors or seats. The big environmental problem with cars is that the pollution comes out of the tailpipe. And so you have NOx and particles and carbon emissions coming out of the tailpipe. That problem disappears 100% with electric cars. So it is absolutely a zero emission vehicle. You could add noise. It is a huge, huge improvement. Then people say, oh, but if you produce the steel or if you produce the battery, you're still producing emissions. Or if your power system is not 100% decarbonized, you cannot say the whole thing is zero emissions. For me, the only thing you're saying there is that the whole economy is not yet decarbonized. Yeah, that's true. I think this is really an unnecessary complication. If I look at the people who have been talking about this for the last 10 years, It's the oil industry and the producers of engines who are trying to say that, well, actually, electric cars might not have tailpipe emissions, but look, they have some other problems too.
How would you assess the current state of e-mobility in the European Union? What are the key indicators we should be looking at? I mean, for example, where does Poland stand compared with the rest of Europe? And where does Europe stand compared with the rest of the world?
If we zoom out a little bit, you see that you've got a couple of big auto markets. You've got China, you've got the United States, Europe, Japan, Korea. Amongst those big car markets, China is the absolute leader when it comes to electrification. But the clear second is Europe. In China, you have 50% of vehicles are new energy vehicles, which is electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids. In Europe, the number is 30%. So people pretend as if Europe is really, really far behind China. That is not the case. We're in a good position, especially when you compare us to the United States, where only 10% of vehicles was electric in the last quarter. And that's, of course, going to go down as Trump takes away all the incentives. Globally speaking, Europe is one of the most important markets for electrification. Now, within Europe, you have, on the one hand, you have the sort of northern markets, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, where in Norway, you're now at 95%. In Denmark, you're at 60, 70%. And then you have the Benelux, where you're around 30, 40%. So these are the leading markets. They're actually big car markets in Europe. Then you have the middle of the pack, which is France and Germany, where you're getting 18, 20%. And then there's the rest of Europe. That's where kind of Poland sits, which is sort of a second wave of electrification, which is Italy, Spain, Poland. Now, the interesting thing is that in 2025, we are seeing a very strong growth in the market for electric cars, in particular also in countries like Poland. I think Poland was in the last quarters of the fastest growing EV market in Europe, which is pretty exciting. And I think 8% of new vehicles in Poland are now fully electric. That's significant progress. It's often said that, but it's going to go slower in Poland. It has to go slower in Poland. I don't actually think that's the case. If you compare Poland with China, or with Portugal, which is also a market that is moving quite quickly, there's no reason why Poland should go slower. I think it depends on the policies. Most of the cars in Poland are company cars bought by SMEs, leasing. This is subject to tax rules. So if you change those tax rules, that's what my country, Belgium, did. The market will shift very rapidly.
So we can easily conclude that the situation in Europe is not bad, but we are far from being delighted.
This is a race. It's a new technology. Like if you think about the history of the automotive industry, like the engine, the car was invented in Germany. But then actually it was Ford who created mass production, and it was General Motors who created car financing. A few decades later, Volkswagen and Toyota were major companies. I think this idea that the race is over, I think this is wrong. The race is happening right now, and I think Europe is in a good position. But whether we make it or not depends on the choices that we make.
Looking ahead, in a time when the European Green Deal is being questioned, can we say that the most Europeans trust e-mobility or not really?
The people that drive electric are generally quite happy. Like the majority of people that drive an electric car, they don't want to go back to combustion engine cars. So it's not as if in Norway or Denmark or Belgium, everybody is deeply unhappy about electrification. The reality is that once people drive these things, they're quite happy. On the one hand, there has been a politicization of electric cars. So it's become a political topic where progressive people say, it's very good because it's good for the climate. And then conservative people say, we don't want this because we don't want the government to force us to do this. I think we need to dial down the debate on this a little bit. In the end, what we're looking at is a new technology. It's a technology that has a number of major advantages. It has some disadvantages. And the biggest disadvantage today is that it's more expensive. And so it's normal that the majority of people don't buy this technology. That's okay. We shouldn't blame people for not spending 10,000 euros extra on an electric car. That's okay. Nobody's expecting everybody to adopt a new technology at the same time. The question is, how does the government create policies that make it possible for as many people as possible to have access to this technology as quickly as possible, yes or no?
Somehow joking, we can say that it's an issue of experience or perception of having an electric vehicle.
Of course, I'm biased, but I've been driving an electric car for a number of years now. I drive it on holidays with my kids in the back all around Europe, and there's hundreds of thousands of other people doing that. And they're all pretty happy. It's a matter of experience. And once you see your friends or your family doing it, you'll try it and you'll see that it works.
What does the sector gain and what does it lose when the entire logic of climate policy is challenged? Is it something good or bad for e-mobility perspectives? I mean, the situation when the Green Deal is questioned and challenged by the Europeans. I think we can say that there is some kind of a trend in Europe right now.
The big problem for industry is when you create lots of uncertainty. In 2022, we agreed that the future for the automotive industry was electrification. Now, for the last years, we've been debating, maybe it is, maybe it is not. What that means for a company is that first you tell them to make a big investment in a new technology. So they build new factories, they make deals with their suppliers, they go and buy stuff, they plan. And then you say, actually, it's not true. Now you have to go and invest in something else. So that means they lose billions of euros. I think what we need is clear direction of travel, and that gives the industry the certainty and the visibility that they need to make the long-term investments. The question is not so much whether absolutely every single car that is sold in 2035 is electric. Maybe there will be a few cars that are not electric. That's not the point. You can continue selling some of the old cars. The question is, what is the direction of travel? Because this is a complete change for the industry, and they cannot make these investments if there's uncertainty.
So I'd like to encourage you to take different perspectives and tackle the question, how do perspectives differ between drivers, car manufacturers, and the governments of major EU countries under current obstacles?
I think what's interesting in the automotive industry is that there's, between the major car makers, I think there is agreement that electrification is a very big part of the future. So even the most conservative car makers, European car makers, say that 50% of cars will be electric in the future. The discussion is whether it's going to be 50% or 80% or 90% or 100%. So that's progress, because 5 years ago, we were talking about whether it was going to be 5% or 10%. So I think we're making progress. Then I think between the different countries, the countries that produce cars, they're obviously much more sensitive to what car producers think than countries like Denmark or the Netherlands that don't produce cars. That's sort of the other division. And then I think there's also something about the wealth of countries. I think in countries like Romania or Bulgaria, the idea that we would shift to EVs, which people perceive to be more expensive, is more challenging than in Denmark or Sweden. The idea that electromobility is expensive, I think, is incorrect. If you look at the cars on the market today, takes the ID.3, you compare that with a Golf. The Volkswagen ID.3 is maybe 1,000 or 2,000 euros more expensive than a Golf in Germany. So it's a 30,000 euro car. Volkswagen is coming with a Polo equivalent and a smaller car, 25,000, 20,000 euros. Now, this is the result of technology that existed a few years ago in the market, because cars, once a car comes to the market, it has taken 2-3 years to build that vehicle. So the technology in that vehicle is 2-3 years old. If you look at the technology that exists today, if you look at the battery prices, if you look at what is possible in China today, it is clear electric cars will become the same price as combustion engine cars and even cheaper. And then once you start factoring in electricity, which is much cheaper than petrol, and once you start thinking about a car not just as a vehicle that you drive around, but as a battery on wheels, a vehicle that you can use to power your home, to use your solar energy, to also send electricity back to the grid, then you can make money on that. That's when electromobility becomes financially a very, very attractive proposition. I think in a few years' time, we're going to be looking at a situation where this is actually the best choice for consumers. And then the question is that product going to be produced by Western and European car makers or only by Chinese car makers? And that's why it's an industrial policy question.
So in this perspective, e-mobility and electric cars are not only a product, but some kind of a tool for a better future.
Absolutely. That's the big difference between a combustion engine car is just like, it's a thing that you can drive around and it runs on oil. An electric car is a battery on wheels and it's a computer on wheels. If you think about the future of the energy system, once you have more wind and solar, you have a renewable-based system, you have more intermittence, you have more variability. What's great about cars is that electric cars is that you can charge them when there's a lot of wind or a lot of sun, and you can use them to balance your energy system. And, you do that with one or two cars, it doesn't make a big difference. But the point is that we sell 15 million cars every year in Europe. It becomes the biggest form of battery storage in Europe in a few years' time.
So it looks like escape to the front from our current problems.
I think it's very exciting development. I think a lot of people don't yet understand how big the potential is with those vehicles. And then, of course, you take it a step further. You start talking about autonomy. An autonomous vehicle system is essentially a computer on wheels. I think it would be a bit strange to run computers on combustion engines.
If you would like to bring us a bit closer with global circumstances, let's say, we are talking about industry, but and now we are witnessing a global trade war. I would like to ask you how it is affecting the development of e-mobility in Europe.
I think what it's doing is forcing European governments to think much harder about supply chains. Europe, for a very long time, we thought that the world was one open market and you could buy everything, what you wanted anywhere in the world. If you would place an order, it would arrive just on time and your suppliers would never create problems. I think we're seeing, we had a major crisis on chips. We had a major crisis on critical minerals. I think people are realizing that this is no longer the case. And so all these trade wars are forcing us to essentially create industries in Europe that can supply the majority of what Europe needs. And this is a complete paradigm shift because we were in a globalization phase and now we're in a regionalization phase. And this is a big challenge for the European auto industry, which is multinational by nature. So they are in China, in the United States, Asia Pacific, and in Europe. And that's how they built their supply chains. And now that needs to change. And they don't like that, but there's no other way. It's an opportunity because you can partially reindustrialize Europe. You can produce more in Europe. But of course, it doesn't come for free. It has a cost. Because production in Europe is more expensive than production in China. That is a big challenge. So you're trying to, do security and competitiveness. That's a big challenge for Europe. But if we don't do that, we will end up in a place where China controls the entire e-mobility supply chain. And it is certain to use this to the advantage of its own companies. So it's going to be very hard for the European automotive industry to compete globally if it doesn't have a strong base in Europe.
Just to sum up this part of our conversation and to highlight the main takeaways, let's confront with the myth or the truth, I don't know, whether the e-mobility development in Europe is on the collision course with the EU's efforts on the technological neutrality and independence or not, in a short and a long perspective.
The people that have been talking about technology neutrality for the last 10 years are the people who don't want to go electric. They're the people that say that combustion engines and biofuels and e-fuels are as good as electric cars. This is not true. I am for technology openness, but I think you should not be blind either. It's clear that a car running on biofuels made out of palm oil, etc., this is not equivalent to an electric car. The longer story is that, yes, you can have diversity, you can have technology, you need to be open, but you cannot tell your industry to invest in 10 things at the same time. You need to be clear on where you want to go. And that's ultimately what those car companies need to be competitive in the future.
So that's why e-mobility is not an electric vehicles. It's an ecosystem of actions taken in the aim of building up the EU industry stronger and stronger.
That's right, because if you want e-mobility to succeed in Europe, you need a battery industry. A battery industry needs cathodes. If you want to build cathodes and cells, you need access to raw materials. Like if you're a company, like a major industrial player, and you need to build up that supply chain, that's going to cost you several billions of euros, and you need to make that money back. So you're only going to do that if you know for sure that there's a market. If you are a charging company, so you go to your investors and you say, oh, we have an idea, we're going to place fast chargers all across Poland. If the next thing the government does is say, oh, actually, we don't know, maybe we want to go for hydrogen or biofuels. Well, basically the business case for that company is dead. The same thing for the grid operator. Like the difference between a world where we have lots of electric cars and we don't is very significant. Like, are we asking our electricity grid operators to prepare for a world where we have electric vehicles that can give energy back to the grid? Or is everything going to remain the same? These are very fundamental questions. people have made a big sort of political thing out of this phase out date, the 2035. The point of the 2035 phase out date was to give clarity to all these people in the ecosystem that yes, we're moving in that direction. It has worked because 5 years ago, 2% of cars sold were electric, and now it's 20%.
Inspiring. What are the three biggest drivers powering the growth of e-mobility in the EU? What's pushing the transition forward, and what kind of policy is needed?
Right now, we are still in a market where policy, and in particular the EU CO2 standards, drive the market. This is what is forcing the big legacy car makers to invest in new EV platforms to increase the sales of the vehicles. So policy is number one. Number two is competition. The fact that we now have companies like Tesla, but in particular also 10 Chinese companies or 20 Chinese companies that most people have never heard of except for BYD, this is also spurring European industry forward. Because companies like Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW, they are present in the Chinese market. They are exposed to this competition. If they want to survive in China, they need to be good at electric cars. That's number two. I think the third point, and that's in particular true at national level, is do you have good incentives? Are you making it easy and attractive for people and companies to go electric or not? And so that's where company cars and purchase subsidies and things like the availability of charging at work, at home, on the highway, that makes a big difference. I think what we're seeing in Poland is that recently those incentives are better aligned. And so you immediately see that the market starts to go up. These for me are the three big things: policy, competition, and incentives.
So the second big detailed question, what are the three biggest barriers or bottlenecks slowing the development of e-mobility in Europe? Which one should we tackle first if we want to accelerate the transition?
The single biggest thing that people look at when they buy a car, like the majority of people, and not the very rich people, is how much does the vehicle cost? And so you have a budget, you're willing to spend maybe 15,000 or 20,000 euros, or in a leasing contract, 400, 500 euros a month. And then somebody says, oh, but I've got an electric car that's 10,000 euros more expensive. Yeah, that's a problem. And for most people, that's an insurmountable problem. So the price is the most important element. The way you make products cheaper in industry is by producing more of them. So that's what's been happening in the mobility sort of industry, is that we went from a couple of thousand to a couple of 100,000, now to a couple of million electric cars. And the more you sell, the more the unit costs come down. And the better, and you have innovation, process innovation, but also technological innovation. The most important thing we need to do is we need to continue policies that promote the scale up of electromobility, because that forces the cost down. And what's really important about the CO2 standards is that that's exactly what they do. And they don't force anybody to buy an electric car. Like, nobody in Poland has to buy an electric car because of EU regulation. You don't have to. But your car maker and your car dealer, they have to try and sell you an electric car. So they're going to make the car more attractive and cheaper so that you're more likely to buy it. So this is really fundamental about the CO2 standards. And then, of course, there's a lot of other things. Is there a good business case? Is the electricity cheap? Can I charge where I need to charge? Do I have a good fast charging network? Those things are important, but I think the fundamental thing is the price. And then this is less objective, but we are in a situation in the United States where electric cars have become political. Republicans don't like electric cars. And I think we really need to avoid in Europe that we get into that position, because it's a technology. It's not an expression of your of your identity or your politics. It's just like, it's a car. It's a car that doesn't emit and that hopefully saves you some money.
So what, in your opinion, should we consider the true measure of success of e-mobility by 2030 or 35? What would we see as a failure, and what would be a warning sign that the transformation is moving too slowly?
I would be very happy if in 2030, around half of new cars sold in Europe are electric. And I think we are actually on track for that. We're going to be at 20% in 2025, maybe like 25% in next year, 30% the year after. We're on track for that. And I think that's really a tipping point. Once, as a company, you sell more electric cars than combustion engines, the balance changes completely. Right now, you need to understand, like, a lot of those companies are still primarily combustion engine companies that also try to sell electric cars. That is going to change fundamentally. I think once you have 50% of new car sales, this is no longer a niche project for rich people. It's something that normal car buyers and SMEs and one-man companies that they buy, and it becomes normal. Basically, that is for me the measure of success. It becomes a normal thing. You don't have to interview me about it anymore.
This is something the European Commission is working on. I mean, on December 10th, the European Commission is expected to publish the so-called corporate fleets proposal, which would require 60% electric vehicles by 2026 and 100% by 2030 in company fleets. What do we know about this initiative right now? What do you expect?
I'm a huge fan of this idea because if you look at the corporate car market in Europe, it's 50-60% of cars are sold to companies. And actually, most normal people don't buy new cars. Most normal people buy second-hand cars. That's true in Poland, but it's also true in Western Europe because actually new cars are very, very expensive. It's much smarter to buy second-hand cars. Companies buy new cars, and they often buy them in a way under a scheme. They're basically part of their business operating expenses. So that makes it part of their tax deductible expenses. We have a couple of countries where they said, why don't we change the tax rules a little bit on the company car tax so that it's more attractive to lease or to purchase electric cars. And what we saw was that the market for electric company cars, it completely boomed. So that is the case in Belgium, where everybody has a company car. And now it's like 50% of new company car sales are electric. From 2 years ago, it was like 10%, now it's 50%. And I think the European Commission looked at that and said, that is a great way to boost the market in Europe and to do it in a way that it doesn't put too much pressure on normal consumers. We do it through tax changes, we make it attractive, and we create a big market for the vehicles that European car producers are trying to sell. So what do we expect? I expect that on the 10th of December, the Commission proposes a law that requires member states to put in place tax policies and incentives that mean that the corporate car sector goes almost entirely electric by the end of the decade. And that may sound crazy, but I am Belgian. A couple of years ago, almost no company cars were electric. Now half of them are electric. And I can tell you, there has not been a revolution. People are not complaining. It's fine. It's fine because these cars are very good cars.
So all we can do is be patient and wait for the details and final Brussels proposal. And finally, a question that really fires a public debate. I would like you to ask yes or no. Will the EU ban on selling new combustion engine cars from 2035 actually hold? And if not, what would Europe's plan B look like?
Based on what we know, the ban will not remain in place. The Commission will make a proposal that maybe looks as if the law stays the same, but as a matter of fact, they're going to provide industry with some flexibilities which will allow them to sell combustion engines after 2035. This is very likely. The big question is, do we keep a clear signal for electromobility, yes or no? I think this is, for me, the single most important thing. If it were up to me, I would keep the 100% electric by 2035. But I understand politically that's maybe not possible or not desirable. But what is really important is that we don't start creating a lot of confusion in the industry, because I don't think that's in the interest of Europe or Poland or any of the countries.
So nevertheless, let us look to the future with optimism, but also realism. William Todts, the Executive Director of T&E Brussels. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Na dziś to wszystko. W kolejnym odcinku sprawdzimy, jak elektromobilność może stabilizować polski system energetyczny. Posłuchajcie również innych podcastów Polityki Insight, które znajdziecie na większości platform podcastowych.